because it has only phenomenal knowledge for its object, this exposition seems not to be science, free and self-moving in its own peculiar shape. Yet from this standpoint, it can be regarded as the path of natural consciousness, which presses forward to true knowledge, or as the way of the soul which journeys through the series of its own configurations as though they were the stations appointed for it by its own nature, so that it may purify itself for the life of the spirit and achieve finally, through a completed experience of itself, the awareness of what it really is in itself. Hegel begins this short section, number 77, in asking a question that's in some degree rhetorical. Is this exposition, this Darstellung, this account that he's providing here in the Phenomenology, is this really science, or is it something else instead? Is it really scientific, might be the question to ask. Does it really have the character, the essence of the kind of inquiry that is science? And when we look at the two issues that he brings up, we see that we're dealing with Hegelian Wissenschaft, Hegelian science, with something that's a bit broader, more comprehensive, more self-reflective than what we ordinarily think of as science today. He talks about it having to be free and self-moving, and I think that we can relate to that to some degree in talking about, say, the need for science to be an autonomous investigation. But self-moving means it really sets its own agenda, but it does so in relation to what it's finding, what it's discovering. It says, I want to know more about that. I'm going to go and do the work for that. He also talks about it as being concerned with only phenomenal knowledge. Now, this is kind of an interesting point to think about for a moment, because if you look at a lot of the philosophy of science in the 20th century and even in the 19th century, they would say that all science can really focus on is, in fact, phenomenal knowledge. The science cannot get behind the appearances. It can only work with what can actually be observed. And, we can extend our possibilities for observation through all sorts of apparati and thought experiments and deductions and all sorts of things along those lines. But ultimately, we're saying that if it is scientific, it has to be something that falls within the realm of the phenomenal. Hegel is saying, I'm doing phenomenology here as well. I'm actually doing a phenomenology not only of the sciences with a sort of small s, but of the whole history of human consciousness and the capacity to reflect upon it at this time in the privileged present. But all of that is ultimately going to be, for Hegel, still phenomenal. And there's going to be this interplay that we're going to see in the next few sections about what actually is phenomenal. Is there something beyond what we think of as what we're getting here, the appearance? So he goes on, and he says, look, what's really happening here is that we're talking about a process, and that's why I've got this arrow here. We're looking at a process that can be understood in several different ways. One of them is to focus on what he's calling natural consciousness. And he's using the word consciousness, Bewusstsein there, that he's going to be using throughout the entire phenomenology. What does it mean for it to be natural consciousness? It means that it's the sort of taken for granted standpoint of a particular time. We've talked about this a little bit before in previous sections, but it's good to sort of stress this. Natural consciousness is the kind of standpoint that one has, and one's getting it from one's culture, from where one stands, without having to think about things, without having to investigate. It just sort of comes to one. And we're always in some position where we have some sort of natural consciousness. Even if it's to be like total skeptics, that can be part of a culture. That can be something that somebody inherits. And so there's always things that a consciousness, a particular consciousness, is taking for granted, and that's the natural consciousness. Interestingly enough, it can be from culture, right? We often oppose nature and culture, but that's a whole different conversation. He also talks in terms of the soul. And here Hegel is invoking a kind of common disjunction between soul and spirit that's been popular at various times in history, including his own era, where this is something that actually turns on a distinction that Paul perhaps meant to make, perhaps didn't mean to make, because Paul engages in a lot of really fancy, shifting rhetoric in his letters. Paul talks at some points about soul and at some points about spirit. Now the Gnostics looked at that, and actually some Orthodox Christian fathers and doctors as well, looked at that as an important distinction to make. Hegel is going to kind of pick up on that. I don't want to go too much into that, other than to say that soul would be something like natural consciousness. It's bound to a particularity. Whereas spirit has a kind of universality to it. So, where is natural consciousness striving towards? Knowledge. What is the soul trying to, go through these stages to ultimately reach? The life of the spirit. And what's important here, Hegel's talking in terms of Gestalten, or stages, steps, shapes of consciousness. The translation here is actually configurations, so you're not getting the fact that he's talking about Gestalten here, but he's talking about traversing this path towards true knowledge, going through the series of its own configurations as though they were stations appointed to it by its own nature. So the things that we're going to be looking at as we're going through the rest of the phenomenology, those are the stages, those are the steps, the Gestalten. And Hegel thinks that we need to pass through them one by one, and thereby sort of replicate what's been going on through the development of consciousness in history. Now, what is the payoff for that? That's what I've got over here. Notice the terms that he's using: a completed experience, an awareness of. And it's not just of, the reason I put the ... ellipsis there, it's not just of, say, the phenomena, it's not just, say, of, things outside that we want to get to know. It's also of the self. It's also of where we are, where we as the knowing subject, we as those who participate in the life of the spirit. It's self-knowledge related to other knowledge, knowledge about the other, whether that be another person, whether that be the past, whether that be the natural world, whether that be a cultural world that we feel alienated from. All of that is involved in this sort of integrating process. So that's what's going on in this section. Natural consciousness will show itself to be only the notion of knowledge, or in other words, not to be real knowledge. But since it directly takes itself to be real knowledge, this path has a negative significance for it, and what is in fact the realization of the notion counts for it rather as the loss of its own self, for it does lose its truth on this path. The road can therefore be regarded as the pathway of doubt, or more precisely as the way of despair. For what happens on it is not what is ordinarily understood when the word doubt is used, shilly-shallying about this or that presumed truth, followed by a return to that truth again, after the doubt has been appropriately dispelled, so that at the end of the process the matter is taken to be what it was in the first place. On the contrary, this path is the conscious insight into the untruth of phenomenal knowledge, for which the supreme reality is what is in truth only the unrealized notion. Therefore, this thoroughgoing skepticism is also not the skepticism with which an earnest zeal for truth and science fancies it has prepared and equipped itself in their service. The resolve in science not to give oneself over to the thoughts of others upon mere authority, but to examine everything for oneself and follow only one's own conviction, or better still, to produce everything oneself and accept only one's deed as what is true. The series of configurations which consciousness goes through along this road is in reality the detailed history of the education of consciousness itself to the standpoint of science. That zealous resolve results this education simplistically as something directly over and done with in the making of the resolution. But the way of the soul is the actual fulfillment of the resolution, in contrast to the untruth of that view. Now, following one's own conviction is, of course, more than giving oneself over to authority. But changing an opinion accepted on authority into an opinion held out of personal conviction does not necessarily alter the content of the opinion or replace error with truth. The only difference between being caught up in a system of opinions and prejudices based on personal conviction and being caught up in one based on the authority of others lies in the added conceit that it is innate in the former proposition. The skepticism that is directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness, on the other hand, renders the spirit for the first time competent to examine what truth is. For it brings about a state of despair about all the so-called natural ideas, thoughts, and opinions, regardless of whether they are called one's own or someone else's, ideas with which the consciousness that sets about the examination of truth straight away is still filled and hampered, so that it is, in fact, incapable of carrying out what it wants to undertake. In section 78, Hegel is doing some very interesting, almost amazingly clear stuff regarding the project that he's involved in and that we as readers are embarking on. And one of the things that I don't have on the board that we do want to keep in mind is what he's talking about here is what is going on when we're going through these stages of consciousness, when we're traversing the path that he has laid out. He's going to speak here about a road or a path of despair or of doubt. And that's a really interesting locution. We'll come back to that in a moment. But what we want to think about is that this path is actually the pathway tracing out the development of human consciousness. He actually speaks about it as the education of human consciousness. And an education is different than merely showing up and getting some training. Consciousness is being developed, is being unfolded, is having its capacities revealed to it and worked on the way. Something new is happening at each stage, and that something new is being assimilated into later stages. If it ends up getting forgotten and left behind, then we have a bit of a problem. That does happen in history quite a bit, and the dialectical process doesn't always produce successes. Now, how do we end up on this road of doubt or despair? Beautiful, idea there that we have to traverse this process without sort of thinking ahead of time that, well, it's all going to turn out, well in the end. Human history has been inhabited by a couple different motifs. One of them is, when we get to that spot over there, it's going to all make sense because we've got sort of the blueprint for it, and that's where the real stuff is going to happen. That's the optimistic viewpoint on history. It's all crap, and it's just the same crap over and over and over again through different permutations. That's another viewpoint. That's a rather pessimistic viewpoint on human history. Hegel is advocating something that is somewhat like the optimistic view, but he's saying that we have to go through this process as if we don't know that it couldn't be the other way. This is where it gets really, really interesting to reflect on just what is going on in Hegel. Is he truly the optimist? The real is the rational is the real, everything's already completed in the system. That's one view of Hegel. Or is he saying, maybe the future is still somewhat open, and I'm giving you the tools here? So I leave that up to you to sort of think about. Now, he starts out talking about natural consciousness again, which we just covered in the last section. And he says that natural consciousness and its relationship to knowledge is less straightforward than it assumes. One of the features of natural consciousness, of the sort of body of knowledge, the body of what passes as being a well-informed person, having the right formation, having the right ideas about things, is that it takes itself as having knowledge. But you go back to classic texts, classic dialogues, like for example Plato's dialogues with Socrates, and he starts asking people about their natural consciousness with respect to things like virtue or what knowledge is. And they start hemming and hawing. They start saying, well, I thought it, like Meno, for example, man, I've given speeches about this. What's going on here? I thought I knew what I was talking about. Obviously, other people thought I knew what I was talking about. But when it's really put to the dialectical test, it turns out that all natural consciousness has is the notion of knowledge, and that there's sort of a bar here to knowledge itself, to what it is that it needs to have. So it's destabilized. It's relativized, you can say, in the process. Now, why is Hegel using this term notion or Begriff here? He plays quite often in a lot of these passages a kind of double game with this, because we have a notion of knowledge, and that's better than just sort of a blank idea, because there is some sort of developmental process going on there. Remember, when you have a Hegelian notion, there is some sort of, self-othering and reincorporation of that otherness, and that is going on in natural consciousness. But it's not fully developed. It's not going through all the way. There is a completed notion, Hegel says, of knowledge that natural consciousness is actually aiming for, that it's haunted by. And the difference between these two is part of what is haunting it. So natural consciousness is going to try to push through that, and in the process of doing so, it gets revealed to not be as knowledgeable as it thought it was. So that introduces doubt. And that can introduce despair. Now, Hegel has some really interesting things to say about doubt at this point. He says, when we're talking about doubt, we're not talking about the ordinary sense that people have. Like, well, what am I going to have for dinner? I don't know. Is there something in the crock pot waiting for me when I get home? I'm kind of in doubt about that. But then I get home and turns out I did turn the crock pot on and put, some sort of thrown together dish in there. Or, it's, there's nothing there, and now I know. And he calls this shilly-shallying, we might say screwing around, puttering with the things that we want to know about. And that's not really doubting. That's just sort of playing around. So he says, there's a return to that truth again after the doubt has been appropriately dispelled, so that at the end of the process, the matter is taken to be what it was in the first place. That's not a productive, that's not a changing kind of doubt. Now, think about a different kind of doubting. I doubt whether my wife is really faithful to me. Now, I could have I get the private investigator, and he or she goes out and follows them around, for a month or so. Nothing's happening. And I say, all right, everything's back to normal, hunky-dory. Or they bring me some photographs, or nowadays I suppose it'd be JPEGs, right? And that they email to you. And they say, well, I got some bad news for you, Mr. Sadler. And now, my situation has changed, but now I have some knowledge. That's not quite what Hegel's talking about. Now imagine if you were wondering about that sort of thing, and you're doubting whether somebody is really sincere or faithful in their commitments, and that's beginning to change you. It could change you in bad ways, right? You could turn into a paranoid, suspicious jerk, the kind of person who actually drives somebody else into somebody else's arms. There's great movies about that sort of thing, especially like the French movie Hell, Fair. Exactly that sort of thing happens in it. Now, that's a different sort of process of doubting. There's something dialectically productive. So Hegel says, on the contrary, this path is the conscious insight into the untruth of phenomenal knowledge. Untruth of there being everything wrapped up within the realm of what's seen, what's granted, what natural consciousness is up to. He says, for which the supreme reality is what is in truth only the unrealized notion. Over here it's the completed notion, right? So this skepticism is not the skepticism with which an earnest zeal for truth and science and fancies is prepared and equipped itself for the service. Now he's introducing skepticism, and skepticism is doubt only turned into a general attitude, turned into even a method. And science, modern science, was often quite skeptical about certain things. It couldn't be too skeptical because, of course, you can't actually do anything if you're hyper-skeptical. But we want to get to this completed notion of knowledge, and we realize that what we've got so far phenomenal knowledge is incomplete. And now we're like, oh man, what am I going to do? Maybe none of this is any good. Maybe I can't get beyond it. Maybe I should, in fact, fall into a kind of skepticism. And Hegel goes on, and he says, this thoroughgoing skepticism is not the skepticism which earnest zeal for truth and science is doing, right? So there's two different kinds of skepticism here. The resolve in science not to give oneself over to the thoughts of others. Here we have this issue down here, upon mere authority, but to examine everything for oneself and follow only one's own convictions, or better still, to produce everything oneself. You know, the ultimate DIY, right? And accept only one's deed as what is true. So what happens with natural consciousness? Natural consciousness, where did it get its ideas from? About what counts as knowledge, you know, what it can take for true, what it can use to make some progress. So it got it from somebody else, generally from some sort of authority, a body of authority. It doesn't matter who it is, it's somebody other than the self. And so the person says, like Descartes did, or actually like Hobbes did, in large respect, in you know, his own project, empiricism is in large respect a way of saying, I'm going to find things out for myself. I'm not just going to listen to the experience of others. I am the experiencing self who's going to find this out. So empiricism and rationalism really actually reinforce each other in modern philosophy. In any case, what happens is the self says, if I want to get over here, I can't just rely on what other people have been saying, what they've been teaching me. Because all that's going to give me is this notion of knowledge, not the real thing. What happens in the process through history, like Hegel says, is that this happens over and over and over again in important ways that contribute something new, where a particular self following out its own convictions, rejecting to some degree what other people are putting forth in front of it, and exercising a certain kind of freedom towards that, produces something that hasn't been, you know, brought up before. Now that can become, of course, a new authority, and that is, in fact, what happens throughout the course of history. So he says, the series of configurations, the Gestalten, which consciousness goes through along this road, is in reality the detailed history of the education of consciousness itself to the standpoint of science. So we've got this building process going on throughout all of human history. A lot of divergences. He's not saying that everything is constantly progress or anything like that. But on the whole, in human history, in development, we have something going on that is introducing more and more to the very consciousness of humanity itself. So he goes on and he says, the zealous resolve represents this education simplistically as something directly over and done with in the making of the resolution. We know with just about anything, simply saying, I'm going to do this doesn't mean that it actually happens. But the way of the soul is the actual fulfillment of the resolution, in contrast to the untruth of that view. So this is something that one actually has to learn, you might say experientially, but the experience that we're talking about is not, you know, showing up someplace and taking a seminar instead, or, you know, putting your hands in something, oh, now I know what goop feels like. Rather, it's thinking, it's reflecting along, it's going through the entire process that's detailed here in the Phenomenology. So he says, let's think this out now. We've got this contrast between following one's own convictions versus giving over to authority, and that means giving over to the authority of somebody else, somebody else's convictions, because they were at one time, you know, in that same position of the self. So he says, following one's own conviction is more than giving oneself over to authority. So there's kind of an advance in doing that. It's important for any sort of human development that a person actually break to some degree with the past, break to some degree with the mindset of others, and say, I, use the first person singular. But what's the problem with that? Hegel goes on and he says, the only difference between being caught up in a system of opinions and prejudices based on personal conviction, because that's very possible. Following your own personal conviction might in fact turn out to be just following, your own ideas about things. If you reject natural consciousness, that's not to say that your own idea of things is any better. As a matter of fact, it could be worse. Maybe you're actually benefiting by taking on the perspective of other people who managed to make it through their lives instead of reinventing everything. And this is the constant problem that adolescents face, isn't it? They need to break away to some degree, but if you break away, quite often you find out that what you're engaging in is adolescent nonsense, and then you regret it later on. So opinions and prejudices, they don't make it doesn't make any difference whether you're getting them from yourself or whether you're getting them from somebody else. He says that there's an added conceit that comes with getting them from yourself that is innate in the former position. Now, he goes on here and he goes back to this issue of skepticism. The skepticism that's directed against the whole range of phenomenal consciousness, the whole range of everything that's being perceived, not only perceived, but felt, imagined, intuited, all this sort of stuff developing throughout history. That's all phenomenal reality or that's all phenomenal consciousness for Hegel. He says, renders the spirit for the first time competent to examine what truth is. This despair, this skepticism is a necessary step that we do need to pass through in order to make some progress. It's not enough to say, I'm going to be my own man, I'm going to be my own woman, I'm going to, be original or anything like that. That's fine. That's kind of superficial. That's not real skepticism. The real skepticism faces up to the possibility that perhaps this is all nonsense, perhaps none of this works, perhaps it's all bad, and then it recovers from that. He says, it brings about a state of despair about all so-called natural ideas, thoughts, and opinions, regardless of whether they're someone else's or one's own. Ideas with which the consciousness that sets about the examination of truth straightaway is still filled and hampered, so that it's incapable of doing what it needs to do. So what we need to do is pass through a kind of purification where we not only say, well, I'm going to reject authority, I'm going to get away from, my upbringing, I'm going to get away from my prevailing culture, I'm going to be different, I'll be an Apple user and, one of those original thinkers. Hegel says that's not going far enough. You need to also feel despair about whether you can even get it right yourself. And, when I think about somebody who actually did this, who comes to mind for me is René Descartes. And then another guy who comes to mind that way for me as well would be Blaise Pascal, two guys from the same time who really did exemplify what Hegel's talking about. They're further back in the dialectic, of course, as far as Hegel is concerned, because they're early moderns. But they are embodying that sort of, I got to really pass through doubt and skepticism mindset that Hegel's talking about as being necessary for tracing out the path of the development of spirit.